then he was Director of the Food Consumption and Nutrition Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute. And in fact, he was the one who brought me into that job, so I'm always very grateful for that. Thank you.
It's my biggest mistake.
And so he was there for some years, and then moved to be Director of the Institute for Development Studies. He then became the founder of a report called the Global Nutrition Report, on which I worked with him as well for a few years. And then he moved to GAIN and the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And at GAIN, his work is, a lot of it is around engagement with the private sector. And I remember in one of our numerous emails we used to have when we were editing the Global Nutrition Report, having this quite intense conversation over email, over one sentence, in a chapter that Lawrence had written about engaging with the private sector, which I think we came to an agreement. But the point was that it's an area that's quite controversial, to say the least. And when we think about the food system is run by the private sector for the large part, not entirely, but for the large part. And working in public policy, we're concerned with how public policy can influence the food system, and that means influence the private sector. So this issue is really, really important. So Lawrence's work has been in undernutrition to begin with, and I would describe him as one of the most powerful advocates of really getting development to take nutrition more seriously. And I've always been very grateful to Lawrence for being quite progressive in understanding that we need to look at malnutrition in all its forms and thinking about obesity and other forms of undernutrition, and was one of the people that was ready to go on that journey. And I was even more delighted when he took on food systems as one of his causes, which is something that he is continuing to do as he directs GAIN. And I'm very excited to see the direction that Lawrence is taking GAIN. And I hope that this conversation that we'll have this afternoon will be helpful for your work as to moving forward. The title is One of the Research Gaps That Need to be Filled to Help Public-Private Action Be More Effective in Promoting Nutrition. So I think we're starting from the perspective that there are some important research questions here. I just have a little bit of housekeeping to say, that we are being live streamed. It is being recorded. When we go to questions, please use the microphone. There's a hashtag somewhere there if you want to tweet, and if the fire alarm goes, it's a real fire alarm. And I wanted to say something else as well, so I don't forget at the end, which is that we're currently recruiting for 2 positions at the Centre for Food Policy, a communications position as well as the position of research coordinator for the centre. There are some bits of paper around that position if you're interested, and if you know anyone else who might be interested. But with no further ado, Lawrence, please.
Thank you, Corinna. I think can you hear me okay? Yeah? Thank you, Corinna. That was a really nice introduction. And thank you guys for coming on a beautiful, hot, sunny afternoon in London. There are so many of them. It's really appreciate you coming. It's quite easy it's actually quite an easy seminar to do, because I'm talking about what you guys should be doing. What are the research gaps? What needs to be filled? I'm not going to give you too many answers. I'm going to give you some guesses, some propositions, and I'm going to give you some priorities. But this is sort of one of the least evidence-based areas that I've ever really worked in. So I think this is a kind of a wide open space for you to tackle and take on. And I'm really pleased to be here. I think it's always a privilege to take part in anything Corinna is involved in. She's really dynamic and careful. She speaks truth to power. She doesn't take crap from anyone. Sorry, that's live stream, but it's true, and that's good. You need to, if you're going to be a researcher, you need to be a researcher that cares, that does the things, that speaks truth to power, even when it's really inconvenient. And most of the time it is really inconvenient. So I picked this topic, and one of the reasons I joined GAIN was because what I applied to Join Gain was I was so frustrated with the sort of timidity in the public sector of engaging with the private sector, and I was so frustrated with the private sector's complacency and self-satisfaction when it came to engaging with the public sector. And I'm frustrated with that lack of engagement because it seemed to me that there were loads and loads of resources in the private sector that are being invested in food systems. And a very big chunk of that is invested in things that are not terribly helpful for nutrition. So what can we do to make them more helpful to nutrition? And then there are some things that are done that are helpful for nutrition, and how can we essentially accelerate that? So I wanted GAIN to be one of the organizations that tries to not get drawn into the polarity of the debate between everything in business is brilliant versus everything in business is terrible. It's much more nuanced and complex than that, and that's why we need research to help us guide us through that space. So this is my snappy title. Sorry, it's so long. I kind of tried to break it down, and this is the first time I've given this talk, so if it's a bit rough, apologies. These are the 4 questions I thought need to be answered, really. Do we even need PPEs to improve nutrition? Some people would say, no, we don't. Do we have enough of them at an optimal level? Again, really hard to know. My prior on 1 is, yes, we need them, and my prior on 2 is, we don't have enough. What's holding us back, if you accept my priors? And then I think one of the things that's holding us back is very few evaluations, independent, credible evaluations of the existing PPE. So some reflections on what's holding us back. And I think those are also researchable questions. And I've fudged it a little bit. I've called them PPEs rather than PPPs, which the last P is partnership, because PPPs imply something very, first of all, very loaded, but also very formal and contractual. And I think a lot of public-private interaction is not codified within a formal contract that no one ever gets to see except the parties themselves. There's lots of engagements that can be informal as well as formal, or can be project-specific rather than organization-specific. And I wanted to broaden it out. So this is my, again, non-academic definition of PPE. Anything that requires interaction between government and businesses, typically moderated by civil society, to attempt to advance nutrition status. So, do we need it? PPE, do we even need it? Well, I think we do, because it's hard to see these slides, sorry guys, I hope you can see them okay. This is a report that was done by the Committee on Food Security's high-level panel of experts. Now, a high-level panel of experts get a bunch of other people to do their reports for them, and Jess Fanzo, who's professor at Hopkins, led this report, and I was sort of marginally involved in it, but it was really a big team of about 12 or 14 people. And the key conclusions are governments are the key duty bearers to make sure food systems really deliver for nutrition, and businesses are the primary, not the only, but the primary investors in the food system. So businesses have a responsibility to invest sensibly in ways that don't harm nutrition, I think, but they don't think that. They think their responsibility is just to generate profits for their shareholders or stakeholders. And then governments have a big role to play in being activists, being really proactive about shaping their food systems. So both have really critical roles, it seems to me, and they could do them separately from each other, but my prior is that by engaging and interacting, they will reduce the risk of misunderstanding, build up trust in some areas, understand distrust in other areas, and actually ultimately find things they can do together that will be positive for nutrition. And that could be stopping bad things or accentuating good things. Another reason why I think we need them is this incredible mismatch of resources around one dimension of public-private, one dimension of the food system, which is getting us to buy things we don't necessarily need or want. And so here, the 50 million at the bottom is actually a number that Corinna, I think, led the generation of in the context of the Global Nutrition Report for 2016, which was international aid that's invested in diet-related NCDs, the prevention of diet-related NCDs. So really a small number. I don't know if that number's been updated since then. It is now, yeah. Still not big. Okay. It's not $1 billion then. But the $1 billion is the advertising spend of just two of the top US food companies, Hershey and General Mills in 2018. $1 billion. So this incredible mismatch of resources again makes me think, how do we get our hands on some of the $1 billion? Not to spend it, but to divert it into things that are healthy rather than unhealthy. Another reason for engaging with the private sector is the increase in sales of processed foods that's happening in middle and low-income countries. So processed foods, I'm not of the school that says processed foods equals bad foods for health. Some processed foods are good and some are not so good. But processed foods tends to mean businesses in the food system are involved in generating them. And the green numbers, remember, these are changes between 2010 and 2015 in terms of sales, sales in kg per capita. And this is some data that Corinna and I worked on for the Global Panel Report for 2016. The data are from Phil Baker and the Euromonitor data, which only collects data for high-income countries and middle-income countries, and they break the middle-income countries into low-middle and high-middle income. So, I'm just stepping out of the sunlight here. So, you can see the green bars are the high-income countries, like the UK and the US and Europe, and the changes there are very, very small changes in terms of sales of these processed foods. So they're very close to zero, all of them. Where all the growth is happening is in the yellow and the blue bars, and the yellow bars are the upper middle income countries like Malaysia, and the blue bars are the lower middle income countries like Nigeria. That's where all the growth is happening, from a much lower base than the high income countries, but that's where all the growth is happening. So again, sales of this stuff is increasing, the businesses are involved because it's processed foods. I often hear the argument that, well, businesses don't really sell foods. People in low-income countries in rural areas don't really buy foods from markets. They grow their own. And this is data from the World Bank Living Standard Measurement Surveys. These are the 9, my maths isn't very good, the 8 countries, we didn't have data for the 9th one, but these are the 8 countries that GAIN has country offices in. So I'm very interested in these numbers. And I've got, the team at GAIN have these numbers broken down by category, for like 50 different food categories. So we're very interested in what's bought in markets, what's purchased, as opposed to what's grown by the households themselves or received in kind. So in Mozambique, you can see, in fact, most of the countries, the percentage of food purchased in the market is very high in all the urban contexts in all the countries. And in the rural countries, and in the rural areas of these countries, I wasn't terribly surprised by Mozambique and Ethiopia, but I was really surprised by Bangladesh and Kenya. Very high percentages of food purchased, even in rural households in quite poor countries. So again, food purchases implies some involvement of businesses in the food acquisition journey. So again, businesses are relevant. And so we need to find these overlaps between. I'm very proud of this moving circle. It's the first time I've been able to do it. We need to overlap between sufficient profits, and I said the word sufficient. Some businesses are willing to trade off maximizing profits for sufficient profits if there are compensating non-financial, non-immediate commercial interests and good nutrition status. Now, to me, it's all about finding those overlaps, not assuming there is no potential for overlap, and not assuming that it's a complete overlap, but trying to find the overlaps and accentuate them. So my take from rather imperfect information is that, yes, we need to engage. So 2, do we have enough of them? Or maybe enough effective ones is a different question, but a related question. And so, again, I'm getting even more sort of non-evidence based here. I think the public-private space in nutrition is really badly mapped. So I think, why is it really badly mapped? Why are there here be dragons? Well, I think it's really badly mapped because too many of us have been scared off. And I think we've been scared off. First of all, I don't think we see the public-private space in nutrition very clearly. Most of us only see a bit of it. So for me, there are 4 bits to it. There's the food multinational space. There's the non-food multinational space. This could be mobile phone operators, it could be logistics companies, it could be refrigeration companies. Then there's the food small, medium, and large enterprises at the national level. And then there's the non-food small, medium, large enterprise. These squares are in no particular, the size of these squares doesn't mean anything. I have no idea what they are sizes. They will be different in every country. And I think breast milk substitutes and salt, sugar, saturated and trans fats issues where companies violating the International Code of Marketing on breast milk substitutes is a big issue, negative consequences for young children, very big, powerful companies, I would say routinely, some of them occasionally, violating the breast milk code. In other words, marketing breast milk substitutes in ways that entice mothers to give breast milk substitutes to kids under the age of 6 months of age, when the WHO and UNICEF say exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. So that issue, and then the other issue around companies that are producing products that are very high in salt, sugar, saturated and trans fats. And those 2 issues are very important. We know just how important those 3 things are for the global burden of disease and non-communicable diseases. But I feel like we need to sort of address those. So don't skirt them. Don't be scared of engaging with them and resolving with them. And again, our policy is we talk to everybody, but we only work with companies that pass our due diligence code. So violations of BMS marketing in the last 5 years, if any company does that, we don't work with them. But we still talk to companies like Danone and Nestle because I want to tell them, if you do this, this, and this, we and others will work with you. But you have to do this, this, and this. I also want to understand how important the profit imperative is for them in this sector and why they're so obsessed with this sector. Sales are going up in some quite strongly in some countries, but they're also plateauing and going down, breast milk substitutes in some countries. So I'm kind of interested in their perspectives. But there is a big other space we could be operating in as well. So you could say your policy could be, at City University, your policy could be, we're not engaging with any businesses in those areas. And these, in fact, these are our filters for deciding who we work with. And then I think you'll find there's a big space out there, even if you have a very stringent set of filters. So I do think, going back to the question, I do think, it's really hard to go back, I don't think we've got enough of these things, primarily because I don't think there's enough mapping of the potential space for doing that. I don't think we're aware of the potential. And I certainly wasn't aware of it until I joined GAIN. And I saw all the things GAIN is doing, and it's an extraordinary number of different things with the private sector. Mostly with small, medium, and large national companies. So if you're in the public space, I don't think you see that. I certainly didn't, and I'm sort of moderately aware of things, and I didn't see any of it. So what's holding back? Because if you take that premise of yes, you have to engage, and B, there probably aren't enough PPEs, what's holding us back? Well, again, another attempt at some kind of, I don't know, it's not really a conceptual map, but it's trying to make sense of what's inhibiting us from doing more of these PPPs. And here's, in the center, you say few of these engagements. And around the edges, we have different things that I've noticed, and I think other people have noticed. So I think the first thing we have to say is it's a pretty weakly governed space, this PPE space. There's pretty weak accountability. Businesses can get away with doing all sorts of things. They can say one thing on a stage at Davos or at the EAT Forum, and they can do something else, because it's very hard to say. There's no independent assessment mechanism. And I think there's also a great deal of distrust generated by BMS, the NCD, diet-related NCD stuff, and there's world views about, business is good, business is bad. It doesn't have to be in nutrition. People have different, very strong views about the role of the private sector. So I think that's one of the issues. I think another issue is that people are very worried about a significant reputational risk, either as individuals or as organizations. Again, this is before I joined, there was a big discussion around, in the governing body of GAIN about whether we should work with Company X, even though Company X met all of our due diligence criteria, and we felt that the reputational risk was just too significant to work with them. And I think what drives significant reputational risk or fears of reputational risk is a kind of a worldview perspective and a fear of dialogue, a fear that if I do talk and if I say I'm talking, I will get criticized on social media, I'll get shouted down in a public presentation, I will get nasty emails, there'll be snide things written about me on the internet, that kind of thing. And then I think the third thing is that there really is a significant risk of doing harm if you get it wrong. Now, this risk is there if you're an NGO or a government, but I think it's more significant if you're a business, because governments and NGOs are at least supposed to have a positive impact. They're supposed to be doing good. They're supposed to be charities or protectors and respecters and supporters of human rights. So companies are not compelled or bound by those same principles. And so there really is a significant risk of doing harm. And that's driven by a lack of evidence about what works and what doesn't work. And it's also driven by power imbalances. Some big multinationals are much more powerful than some African or small Asian states. On the other hand, some governments are much more powerful than medium-sized and small and even large enterprises at the national level. So there are really big power imbalances, but anyone who knows development knows that that's part of the development process. There are always going to be power imbalances between different agencies, and we have to recognize them and try to navigate them and take them into account, and sometimes shift them. So, again, don't really have any massive insights, or at least massive evidence about what's inhibiting these PPPs. But I actually have commissioned a systematic review to look into that. I don't know what we're going to find, but it's a review across a whole number of different sectors, not just nutrition, because there isn't that much in nutrition. So one of the things, because we're in a research setting, I wanted to focus a little bit on one of these petals, the weak evidence. And I wanted to focus on why are there so few PPE evaluations. And there really are. I mean, there was a review that we had done. We didn't have it done for the GNR, but we cited it in one of the global nutrition reports. I think it was the 2015 or 2016 reports. And it was by John Hodnott and Stuart Gillespie and some others. And they did a systematic review looking at public-private partnerships and undernutrition. So they didn't look at NCDs, which is interesting. They just looked at undernutrition. And they found very few independent, rigorous assessments of the impact. The ones they did find were around fortification, large-scale food fortification. There are quite a few of those. But beyond that, there's very little. So again, I'm just guessing, really. their propositions. I think there are four sort of possibilities here, and maybe more. First of all, there just aren't that many PPEs. Maybe there just aren't many. We think there are lots, but there aren't many. So if there aren't many, it's difficult to evaluate them. Second, they may exist, but they may not be evaluated. Third is they're evaluated, they exist, they're evaluated, but it's not published in public space. And finally, maybe they exist, they're evaluated, and they're published, but not in the spaces that we look for them. It might be in different places. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on each of these. So just from being at GAIN, I've come across all of these PPEs. And these are all ones that I'm very familiar with. The first two at the top are ones that GAIN is the convener of. The one, Seeds of Prosperity, is one that Unilever is the convener of, around workplace interventions for its tea growers around the world. The Africa Improved Food is a DSM, which is a big macronutrient manufacturing company, and the World Food Programme in Rwanda and a couple of other countries. Sun Business Network is a kind of a public-private engagement. It's trying to bring, in I think about 30 different countries, it's trying to bring companies, small companies and medium-sized companies together with government so that companies can understand the government priorities and governments can understand the opportunities that the companies present. And it's to help small and medium enterprises develop investable propositions that are vetted, that we think will actually advance nutrition. And then this Obasima work, which is a quality seal. It's developing a seal that companies sanctioned by government, the companies can put on their products that say this is a healthy product. And that's another example of a different. So they're out there, and these are just the ones that I pulled off the top of my head in 5-10 minutes. They're out there, but they should be listed somewhere. And one of the things I'd very much like to see, and GAIN is doing this, is developing a register of PPEs. Maybe we'll have to default to PPPs because there are a lot of PPEs. Maybe we'll have to restrict it. I don't know yet. But when I was at IDS, we did a lot of work on land grabbing. And I was always very struck about how the land grabbing, this is the acquisition of large tracts of lands by governments or businesses, usually on unequal terms in terms of power balances. The governments that were selling the land were usually ripped off. And there's a independent land monitoring initiative that promotes accountability. What do these arrangements look like? If someone buys millions of hectares of land in Ethiopia, what are the terms of those in broad brush? And I think we could do something similar in the nutrition business space. So the second possibility about why there aren't many PPP or PPE evaluations is that many are not evaluated. And I think the answer to this is probably that's right. And when you think about it, there are pretty weak incentives to evaluate these things. Many of the first wave of these things were corporate social responsibility things. And CSR things tend to be very fluffy, non-core, as you know, fluffy, non-core business kinds of things that, frankly, companies probably don't even want them to be evaluated. And certainly the people receiving the funding don't have any particular strong incentive to get them funded. It may be that they're proprietary. If these PPEs are evaluated, the companies have some kind of intellectual property over the evaluation results. So if you don't negotiate hard at the beginning, and in terms of the contract around the evaluation, you may end up not being able to publish it, especially if it's not very positive. And third, surprisingly, public agencies don't always require it. And this has been my experience, and I'd be interested to know if it's your experience too. Public-private usually involves some government, by definition, government or NGO resources being put in to the activity, the joint activity, and every sort of research grant or public sector grant I've ever got, they're very keen on publishing the results, open source, open access, getting everything out there. But surprisingly, it doesn't always happen. And again, I don't really have a lot of evidence to draw on this because that's not my job, that's your job. But this is a paper, systematic review on PPPs in health. This was partnerships in health, in social science and medicine. And they did a tally of the number of publications where which country, first of all, which countries, this shows you where the publications, these are publications on health infrastructure, PPPs, in the USA, in the UK. So most of the publications are on PPPs in the USA and in the UK. And they're this is health broadly, right? There's very few on from countries in Africa and Asia. So again, not terribly scientific, but sort of a heuristic sense that there isn't much out there. And I'd like to see every call that's made involving public money and private resources having a requirement that you evaluate and you publish the evaluation. It doesn't seem very difficult to me. The third possibility for why there aren't more evaluations out there may be because it's quite difficult to do it, actually. It's quite difficult, certainly if you have, I don't know how many of you are nutritionists or health professionals or health researchers, but the nutrition community has, I think, this is where I can get myself into trouble, but I think the nutrition community has been hijacked by RCT, the RCT paradigm, or the RCT hegemony. You know, it's been taken over by that, and RCTs are one of many methods for evaluating does A have an impact on B, and it's very powerful for things like drugs and testing interventions that can be randomized after the baseline and before the end line, or at baseline to get an impact at end line. But they're not necessarily very powerful methods for evaluating public-private engagements, because those tend to be market-driven or market-based, and market-based activities, no business wants to say, I'm going to restrict myself to this market over here and not work in that market. They want to work in all markets at the same time. So most of the work in this space is around policy research rather than intervention research. And policy research really requires lots and lots of different methodologies. So I would, again, my proposition, which can be invalidated by some serious research, is that PPPs are not so amenable to RCTs, randomized controlled trials. But in any case, even if they were, doesn't mean that RCTs are the most meaningful way of evaluation. And this is a very good, any of you interested in impact evaluation, this is a very good review that was done for DFID back in 2012 by Elliot Stern, who's kind of the guru of impact evaluation. And this isn't about public-private, this isn't about nutrition, this is just generally development. And he said there are three, he and his team said there are three big factors leading to the selection of an impact design. First of all is, what is the question you're trying to ask? It's really, really fundamental. What question you're trying to address? What is the program or the intervention attribute you're looking at? Can it be randomized? Is it everyone at the same time? Is it affecting a certain subgroup? Is it rolled out slowly? Is it community-based? Is it national? Is it international? And then the third thing is, what are the available evaluation designs? There's tons of different ways of evaluating things. So you pick from all three of those things are important in your decision what to evaluate. Some of the outcomes, the other part of the impact evaluation that's difficult is that there are a number of different outcomes. There are, in the marketplace for nutritious food that GAIN convenes with businesses and governments, there are a number of outcomes we're interested in. How many private sector resources are crowded in per $1,000 of public sector resources spent? How many units of nutritious food are sold? Who buys the units of nutritious food? What's happening to the price of the nutritious food? How much is actually eaten and who eats it? And what are the profit profiles? And all of those things, you know, they're not going to move in the same direction, all of those things. And then, in a world that's much better than this world in 5 or 10 years' time, you'd like to have lots of evaluations of PPEs. Then you'd like to be able to say, do some kind of analysis of variance on them to say, I've got 100 of these evaluations. I can codify each of these evaluations by which sector they're in, how the duration, the transparency, the terms of trade, the degree of public sector risk, and then I can kind of begin to figure out what are the characteristics of PPEs that really do yield positive nutrition outcomes. And I think there are lots of, and I just picked this one because it happened to be at hand, but there are lots of research networks like this one, Society for Implementation Science in Nutrition. This is right up their alley. This is essentially implementation research. And I was at the International Union of Nutrition Sciences meeting, which they have every 3 or 4 years, last year in Argentina, and there was nothing on business. There was I scanned the program for keywords. There was nothing on business. The word governance came up once. So there are lots of firepower out there, but it's not actually being focused on these kinds of issues because it's quite hard. It's quite a difficult shift, I think. And then finally, could these evaluations be being published, but we're looking in the wrong place? And possibly. And and most of us, me included, sort of focus on 20 different journals, pretty much, maybe 30. But there are tons and tons and tons of journals. And since I've been at GAIN, I've been looking where some of the GAIN folks have been publishing, and they're in journals I've never heard of, honestly. And here's some of them. I just picked up. I just Googled major food processing journals, and I don't know how many of these you've heard of, but I haven't heard of many of them. I certainly don't read any of them, or haven't read any of them. There are tons and tons of journals out there, and I'm wondering if our systematic reviews are scouring them and including them in the searches. I don't know. Maybe they are. And there are also lots of things that are published not in journals. So GAIN is also in the process of setting up and we haven't come up with a good name for it yet, but a business nutrition hub. It's basically a place where you can go if you want to find out what works in business and nutrition and what doesn't work. That's where you would go to find it. And it's kind of inspired by this World Bank infrastructure, public-private partnerships resource hub, which is, they call it a knowledge lab, but it's really just data studies. We're going to try to make it not just journal article studies, but other studies and other resources. We're going to have to put a quality filter on the stuff that's not in journals, and probably on some of the stuff that is in journals to get it in there. And it's going to be, key audience is going to be business as well as government, as well as donors, as well as researchers. So there just isn't a place where you can find all this stuff, and we want to do that. So just to reprise, research questions that I think need to be answered. Do we need PPEs at all? My prior is yes, but I think it's a researchable question. Do we have enough? Again, my prior is yes, but I think it's a researchable question. What is holding us back? Whether you think there are enough or they should be there, I still think that's an interesting question. What is it that's holding us back? And then why so few evaluations? I think, ultimately we want to get to the stage of what are the features of PPEs that generate positive and negative impact, so that we can get a sensible expectation that, hey, if you do it this way, you're at best you're going to have no impact, and at worst you may have a very negative impact. That's assuming you're not setting out to have a negative impact. And how to maximize your chances, set it up in this way. And we can make sensible guesses about that now. We don't have to wait for research. But it'd be nice to have a constant stream of research that's continually upgrading our assumptions and preconceived ideas about what makes a PPE that has a positive impact on nutrition. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. And now we've got time for questions and a discussion around this pretty important question, a pretty important area. And I'd like to start. I have lots of questions, but I'll just ask one. which is around the needs for evidence from the private sector versus the public sector, and what researchers might want and what businesses might be interested in. So if I can illustrate what I mean just very briefly, I was talking to somebody who works in a very large supermarket in the UK, and he said, we don't need evidence that giving out free apples makes any difference, because for us, giving out free apples to kids is the right thing to do. Why do you need to have any evidence for that? It's just the right thing to do. I didn't quite put it like that, but that was the implication. Whereas for me, I'm like, but if that's where they're putting their effort, and we need to know if it's actually making any difference. And that it's kind of indicated to me that the way that businesses think about evidence is rather different than the way that either a researcher or a public entity might think about it, because their incentives are different. And I'm just wondering whether that might be why there hasn't been more evaluation of these kinds of things which actually emerge from engaging with government.
It's possible. I mean, I've been in conversations like that with government officials as well. I don't need evidence to do this. I know it's the right thing to do. So, but I think if they want, so that this, I think that kind of falls into my CSR publicity kind of stunt. I don't know if that's a core part of their business or just kind of a fringe thing to make. Maybe I'm being unfair on the company in general. But I think if they're interested in whether that's sustainable, if they're interested in whether they can make claims around that, if they're interested in leveraging public sector funding and approval, I think they should be. It's up to us to convince them that actually you do need to generate evidence. And in fact, you don't need their permission to generate evidence anyway. You can just do it, right? Yeah. So I think it's. So I mean, I think there are different motivations, and I kind of said that. I said, companies, especially if it's a CSR kind of thing, I think the incentives are quite weak. But don't let that stop anyone. If anyone wants to do an evaluation of that program, I think that'd be really interesting.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, I will start in this part of the room.
Thank you. So I was wondering about the first question. Do we need them at all?
Introduce yourselves before you ask the question.
Yeah. I'm Nancy. I'm doing a PhD here at the center. And just in terms of the first question of do we need them at all, of course I don't have an answer, but I just thought it was really interesting that on the systematic review on PPEs in health, that the countries who have very good health indicators had very small amounts of PPEs. And so that just makes me think of, are they needed, and does that kind of indicate that maybe you can work without?
The countries that had good health outcomes?
Yeah, for example, Sweden and Norway had very low PPEs. And then, for example, the US, I know it's one of the maybe most inefficient health systems in the world, and they had a lot, so, just something I was thinking
Yeah, no, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, you'd have to normalize by population, but it would still be interesting to see that. I mean, the PPEs are either a response to lots of the PPP evaluations are either a response to lots of PPEs, and lots of PPEs are a response to either a willingness to do something positive, or trying to stop something negative happening, it seems to me. So I think it's be interesting to unpick those numbers. Yes, I don't have a good answer for you.
Okay, thanks.
But can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why do you think? What's your prior, and what's driving your prior about? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
I have to think about that. No, I'm not tending to is it a good or a bad thing, because I just don't know enough about it.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's just what I noticed. Of course, I guess I am generally maybe more on the critical side of
I think it's good to be critical.
Private companies, because I think then if you go into alliances with them, then maybe based on certain values that they are based on. And I think that's not happening a lot of the time. So
I mean, the real answer is you need more that have a good chance of having a positive effect and less of the ones that have a good chance of having a negative effect.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rishi Kalachati. I'm an assistant professor at Warwick Medical School. Just to follow on very quickly from that question, I personally don't have a kind of moral objection for working with companies, given that you kind of know where they stand. Their main aim really is to make profit. So there are issues with working with government where they can make mistakes or have a very careless attitude towards, for example, population health. I've worked for a Ministry of Health before, so I don't have any kind of moral, kind of ideological issue with working with companies. But my question is, it's government role to upscale programs. So, for example, childhood nutritional surveillance, feeding programs, so on. It's fine to partner with companies, but when we're talking about sustainable programs over time, okay, so a government may fall, it may go in, the country may be under conflict and so on, but isn't it risky to go into partnership with a company with the expectation that they're going to maybe prop up a service or activity which the government should be doing? Shouldn't more effort or ways of working with governments, that should be the priority, rather than making it kind of a strategic theme to work with companies? So again, no problem with working with companies, but why the focus? Why not with governments?
So, good question, thank you. My prior on this is you don't want companies doing things that are government's responsibilities, it seems to me. But some people would argue with that as well. In fact, many people would argue with that. They would say, why not? And I don't really have a good answer for you as to why not, but I just think if government has a responsibility to do this, they should raise enough taxes, spend the taxes properly and do it. Where I see more of the opportunities are around activist governments shaping these resource flows. You know, people say the food system is broken, and I've said it myself, but I'm beginning to think that's the wrong framing, actually. I'm beginning to think that food systems, they work brilliantly for profit generation, but for nutrition outcomes and health outcomes and food security outcomes, they are pointed in the wrong direction. So how can government work to point them, at least parts of them, in the right direction through various carrots and sticks? I think to me, that's the bigger area for. I think it's less risky, and I think it's more sustainable. Actually, you're trying to shape the market, which is, after all, a very sustainable thing. You're trying to bend it towards health through your public actions. Sometimes those public actions don't even have to engage with business to do that, but sometimes they do. Even public procurement, which we know has, governments purchase a lot of food. Governments can say, these are the conditions under which we will purchase the food, this is the type of food we'll purchase, these are the kind of companies we'll purchase it from, and they make those criteria clear, and it sends a very strong signal to the private sector about how it should operate. So I'm less comfortable about companies coming in and privatizing a health system than I am about governments coming in and trying to shape something that is ultimately just a private enterprise. Now, the difficulty there is that governments are very weak, usually. They can pass the legislation, but they can't enforce it or monitor it even. Maybe they can monitor it, but they can't enforce it very easily. And one of the things we put in the GNR, which I thought was an interesting idea, the Bloomberg and Gates Foundation set up this anti-tobacco lobbying, anti-tobacco lobbying fund, where it was a fund that governments could apply to get lawyers to counter the campaigns of tobacco-funded lawyers who said these laws are unconstitutional or unfair or whatever. It's very small, I think it's $10 or $15 million, so it's tiny. But I think that's an interesting public response to. That's a kind of public-private engagement. To set that up properly, you have to talk to the private sector and say, we're going to do this, and you better get on board with it. So those of you in the room know more about the sugar levy than I do in the UK. But whenever I've talked to Alison Tedstone, who heads Public Health England, She always says, and I don't know if it's true, I don't know if it's just her perspective, but she always says just the conversation we had with those companies, and Tim would know this better than me, the conversation we had with those companies got them to change some of their behavior even before we actually instituted it. So I don't know. I think I've been generalizing a lot in this seminar, but ultimately it does all depend on context. But if you generalize business bad, business brilliant, you'll never find those opportunities. You'll miss them.
Sorry, does it make it difficult in your position to? Sorry. Does it make it difficult in your position to, as director of GAIN, to work with certain companies that meet a certain criteria and work with them, and then on the other hand, you may have partners who say we want to want to impose regulation on companies that produce these types of products, and your partners aggressively pursue that, which is fine, but on the other hand, you're trying to be quite close with companies and kind of form a partnership. Do you find that a difficult position to be in?
If the companies we're working with exhibit behavior that, if they met our due diligence protocols and then they fall foul of it later on, we stop working with them. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay.
But you come up with, Corinna and I used to come up with this issue all the time in the Global Nutrition Report, and I think they still do. We were supposed to hold governments, businesses, and donors accountable, and donors were the ones funding the report. So it's everywhere. You just have to manage it and be transparent about it.
Thank you. There were some questions over here. The lady in the middle.
Hi, thank you. I'm Ruth Siegel. I'm currently working at Oxfam and also doing a PhD at Spru. Hi.
Hi.
So I was really intrigued by your concept of sufficient profits. And I just wondered, kind of how on earth you have that conversation with a company about what sufficient profits are and what kind of incentives there might be for them to move away from maximising profits towards being happy with sufficient profits.
Well, it's a great question, and I'm just kind of making stuff up as I go along, because I'm new to this, and there isn't much to guide me. But the conversations I have had with CEOs are along the lines of the demand for healthy food and nutritious food is just going to grow and grow and grow. You have two choices. You can be the company that says, I'm going to be the last one to reformulate, or the company who's the first one to reformulate. And if you're the company that's the first one to reformulate, your profits will suffer. Now, most companies, it's extraordinary really, and I'm probably pretty naive about all this stuff, but most companies really are really fixated on their quarterly reports, and they don't think ahead as much as you would think they do. So I'd really like to, there's another researchable topic, look at companies who are the first movers in reformulation. There's actually a lot of companies that have reformulated a lot in the last 10 years. Look at companies who are the first movers and see whether that's had a big profit impact on them over a 10-year period. Not in the first year, it probably did. But my guess, again, my preconceived idea is that they more than made up for that in years 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, because they were seen as a virtuous company that cared about the health of their consumers. So try to have that conversation with I don't always get to talk to CEOs, but senior people in companies, and say, be ahead of the game. This is the way the world is going, Try to turn it into a virtue rather than be the last one who's sort of clinging on. And so the companies also will say, we're not interested in some of them. And it's really important. I've found an incredible variation amongst companies, even big ones in the same sector, as much variation as I'm an economist, as much variation as you find amongst economists. They think what's the optimal employment rate or inflation rate, or so there's a lot of variation. But some of them will say, we don't work with, and they have this horrible classification of consumers, A, B, C, D, E. We don't work with CDEs because the profit margins are much bigger on A's and B's, and we want the best people, and we have to give the best people the biggest bonuses, and we can only afford the biggest bonuses if we work in A's and B's. So it's kind of a circular argument. But there are some that say, actually, we're really interested in the C, D's, and E's, because they're the future. They're like the student who's joining NatWest as an 18-year-old will probably be with NatWest for the next 30 years. Some of them have that vision. So the trick is to see whether it's just nonsense and blather and whether it's real. And that's the difficult bit. You can't get a real insight into the data, and that's why I'm such a big fan of the Access to Nutrition Index, which is a survey of 25 big companies, 300 questions, some of them self-reported, some of them independently verified, about what they actually do, not just what they say, what they do. Sorry, my answers are very long, Corinna.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just going to comment. I had a really fascinating conversation with the head of someone very senior in Triodos Bank, the Dutch social kind of bank, and his view was that we could easily move to a business model that was only 1% profit or something like this, and that as long as shareholders required large profits, nothing was going to change. And he said there's just no reason that can't happen. So there are these different, and I'm sure someone else would say something completely different. But his feeling was that the financial institutions needed to be very much involved, and just going to the food companies wasn't right because it was the financial institutions who were influencing incentives for the food companies. You have a question?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Julius Alejandre. I'm from the Philippines, and I work as a coordinator of salt iodization and food fortification programs back home. But right now, I'm doing my MSc in Wales.
Which country? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Philippines.
Yep.
Yeah, we met before when you went to the Philippines. You floated the idea of weak governments. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts, and how can we drive or push this government to create engagement with private companies? Like, while I was doing like this coordinating job on food fortification, I had experiences of like agencies telling us that like salt iodization is not the priority, so we cannot do anything anymore because for them it's not their priority. So I'm just wondering, how can we like push them or motivate them to create engagement with private companies? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of governance, I default to three components: capacity, accountability, and responsiveness. And I think responsiveness is around, I'd like to see stronger consumer feedback mechanisms, stronger consumer, customer, citizen voice around those sorts of things. So how do we get the media more engaged? How do we get celebrity chefs more engaged? How do we get, how do you make these issues really hit home in terms of soap operas and radio shows and all that sort of stuff? Accountability is around, so in the context of salt iodization, we need to test. We need to test what the government says it's iodizing salt or fortifying food. Are they actually doing that? So independent random tests, and GAME does a lot of those actually. And then the final bit is capacity, and again in the context of fortification, a lot of governments don't have labs to test, or they have the labs but they don't have the knowledge or know-how. So we spend a lot of time training government agents and officials around food safety and fortification. But yeah, it's about all of those things, and it's ultimately about power. So I think the more accountability, the more transparency you can get out, the more you can, I mean, researchers have a really big role to play, it seems to me, to uncover. It's such a massive black box. How do you get under the black box? Get the data out, get the facts out, get the stories out. Sorry not to recognize you.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm doing a Master's in Public Health at the London School, but in my previous life I worked in Marcoms, mostly with the private sector. And I would say I haven't been surprised at kind of the attitude towards the public sector, but I think I've been
Towards the
from
public
nutritionists. I think I've been surprised at almost the extent of the distrust, and I'd say sometimes kind of verging on hatred. And I just wonder how you think is the best way to try and get more nutritionists more open even to engaging with business, and towards the SDG 17 really.
Really difficult. I mean, I think dialogue is really key. We are. I mean, I think this is a really good question. I think the only way you really begin to build up trust is through interactions. I mean, that's whenever I meet a new person and they want to work with me, whether it's in GAIN or outside of GAIN, the only way you really get a measure of a person is by working with them or interacting with them. So I think there have to be safe spaces for interaction, probably at quite an early stage in one's career. It took me 56 years to figure out that maybe there's a whole world out there that I need to start engaging with more seriously, because it could be a good thing for nutrition. So I think early on, I'd like to see, I go to lots of conferences that are 99% public and some that are 99% private. I feel like there usually isn't and I'm not talking about private sector funding public sector conferences, which I'm not very happy about, but just genuine events where people can come together and begin to talk. We've talked at GAIN about some exchange programs, because most of the people at GAIN are really public sector people. Some of them, about a third of them, have worked in the private sector before, usually not in the food sector, interestingly enough. But we've talked about exchange programs. We've talked about professional development programs that bring together 15 business people, 15 public sector people, that they begin to realize that they don't actually have horns on their heads, and they actually speak pretty similar languages, actually. They sometimes use different terms, but the things they care about are usually pretty similar. And actually, I get really annoyed with, and I run an NGO, and I ran one before, and I get annoyed with NGOs who say, we're not about profit maximization, because most heads of NGOs are about building big empires and increasing their revenue streams and raising money to do good, but it's still big is better. So there's a lot of holier than thou stuff coming from NGOs, as well as actually a lot of nonsense coming from business. So it's about injecting a bit of balance into the debate without losing the critical edge, without sort of compromising. And I think that's really difficult, to be balanced and yet call it out when you see bad behavior, and call it and praise it when you see good behavior. So I don't really have a good answer for you, other than
Yeah, that was a good answer.
talk.
Thank you. Tim.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Heather. I'm a dietitian and I work in the NHS, so kind of coming in after that question as well. I already had a question and it sort of relates, because generally the companies that I work with are drug companies, so they're not really producing food, they're producing nutritional supplement products, and then we're sort of kind of going under a contract, if you like, to provide certain products for people in the hospital. And we see from sort of big pharmaceutical studies that there's obviously a bit of a problem when it comes to evaluating the studies, and time again, when they're funded by drug companies, then they tend to produce positive results for those. So I think that feeds in very much to the private sector. And my question was, when you're then looking at doing your evaluations, how would you make sure, if you've got that interaction, that they aren't biased and that you're actually getting good evidence?
So GAIN raises funds for evaluations, and then we do something very hard. We give it to other people. I really don't like doing that, but we have to. So we put out a tender for evaluations. You may have seen, we just had a bunch of them in the last 6 months. Evaluations for our programs. And usually they go to universities, I think, the usual suspects. And we've got no say in them, other than how they're framed. But this is the question we want answered, and that's up to you to answer it. But more generally, this is a massive problem of, who does the research usually generates, you kind of can figure out what the answer is ahead of time. But it's not just confined to private sector. There are lots of studies that are these analysis of covariance or variance studies that there are a bunch. I used to work in the consultative group for international ag research, this international ag research system. And there were lots of these studies that would take, it's a meta study, so it would take 200 studies that say what's the internal rate of return to this technological innovation from the public sector, and it would do the analysis, and it would code each study, who's the author, what type of institution are they, how old are they, what's their gender, what's their nationality, all that sort of stuff. And you would find very significant author effects and organizational effects. This author tends to find internal rates of return that are twice this author. So I'm not apologizing for it, I'm just saying it's part of a bigger problem of peer review. Peer review is not perfect, and I think it's really difficult. But whenever any private sector funding is involved in the research, I think you have to be super, super careful, and there are all sorts of protocols that are set up. They fail sometimes, and they fail sometimes spectacularly. I don't have a good answer for you, sorry.
Lawrence, it's me, Tim Lang from here.
Hi, Tim.
Thank you for the very elegant talk. I was thinking about your 4 questions at the beginning. I don't know if I've got 2 more or what, but that's what I'm going to say. I think the first is actually something very useful would be to try to classify PPPs, PPEs. And I think one of the difficult things, as you were talking about all of this, I was thinking, could one distinguish between good and bad foods? All of that debate in terms of winnowing out the CSR stuff and the fluffy stuff, as you called it, from really potential gain in terms of public health nutrition. I think that will be helped by getting clear classification. And I'm not aware of, Alison is here, ex of Sainsbury, I'm not aware of any classification of PPPs in nutrition. I think partly because of the example you put up rightly of breast milk substitutes. That's kind of poisoned the whole terrain, because here was something clearly bad, agreed in nutrition to be bad, agreed at public policy level, WHO, WHA, all of those things. So classification, your comments on that, because I think you can actually enter some good bads and make, I think that will be researchable. I think that would be a great thing for GAIN to do, to try and clarify different types of PPPs in nutrition. And the second point is relevant to that, is a question to you. Do you think there's something that can be learned from other zones? Because I do. I think there's, that's why I referred to Alison Austin here, I think there's a lot more experience of positive PPPs on sustainable food or sustainability issues and in the environment generally as it affects food, and there's some really strong examples of where there is something positive. I think of carbon counting, carbon checker, she'll get going on it. You know, these are formidable PPPs or PPEs in your terms, which are making and enabling companies to alter their behavior for the public good, reducing carbon, reducing water. So I think that would be a really useful thing to do for GAIN. And to show how it's research sensitive, as you were talking, I was just thinking, I don't know if people know, there was a big SOAS study done for DFID, which looked at fair trade. And it was it's really
Yes,
worth
it's by
looking
our
at.
friend, isn't
It's a damning report about fair trade. It basically says fair trade is got great aspirations, great criteria, great public ethos, but actually it's not getting down to the women. The money is getting lost somewhere just near the baseline. Really interesting research, auditing basically PPP. So those are my 2 points. I wondered, classifications of PPPs, and secondly, learning from other zones.
Both great comments, and that, when I put that rather fanciful picture of Here Be Dragons, that's kind of what I meant. It's not a very well mapped terrain in terms of.
Well, I think that's
what's
something
possible.
could be researched.
Absolutely, it's a researchable topic.
We've actually got 2 PhDs which are in that zone. One doing a really interesting comparison of how a European knowledge hub and a British knowledge hub are dealing with sustainable food as exchanges of information. Really interesting. And the other is more as a comparison of how different public health nutrition campaigns have and haven't negotiated success with food companies. And obviously the breast milk substitutes issue sits like this great
And
big
learning from
septic tank in the middle of it all.
Learning from other sectors, absolutely, and other experiences. The resource one, energy, water, it is a good one to learn from, but the incentives are much more aligned, I think.
They are, but they're also not. Remember, energy, come on, you're the economist. The energy prices are really good incentives for food companies not to bother about it, because actually energy costs are very low in the food companies. Very low indeed. There's no incentive for companies to actually cut carbon. Not really. There's incentives for farmers to cut carbon, but not for food companies. So that they have done it and are doing it in a dramatic way. Again, while you were talking, you were in IDS at Sussex, at SPRU, someone from SPRU here, Science Policy Research Unit, I think one of SPRU's biggest impacts was Andy Sterling and SPRU influencing Unilever to create the Sustainable Living Index, which has done exactly what you said you wanted food companies to do. Over now it's 9 years, has done a commitment to on across a whole range of things.
Looking at profit trade-offs.
Looking at profit. And the beginning of that, as it were, PPP or PPE, Unilever said, Paul Pullman said, I was there when he said it, said, we're not going to make big profits from this, but it's the right thing to do, but in the end we will. And it's happened. If you look
The
at,
real
if you follow
question
their
is, why is
tracking,
Unilever like that?
Well,
is that just Paul Pullman, or
well,
what is that?
I'll answer it.
Another
We did a
researchable
study
question.
here. We did a study here in 2004 for the WHO, where we took the top 25 food companies, the top 10 food manufacturers, top 10 retailers of the world, and the top 5 food service, and we audited them against the World Health Assembly's goals on NCDs. And that was the model, the banker that we used to help us on that is Rachel Crossley, who's the driver behind the creation of ANI. So, I mean, we tried to think that through, to have external criteria for how you judge the companies. Now, the problem is we haven't got that sort of thinking on nutrition laid out as clearly by WHO. So actually we could do with public criteria to then evaluate companies against, is my thinking.
And you're giving me things for Gain to do, but City
Take your chance, Gabe. Take your chance.
This
big budgets here.
This centre is you guys could be the biggest, maybe you already are, the biggest and the best European centre on food policy research, focusing in this area. I mean, it's a wide open space, it seems to me. Most of the big players are too timid to get into it on a research basis.
I agree. I want Corinna to work harder.
Just clone yourself.
One question here, one question there, and then over there.
Hi, my name is Lori. I'm doing a PhD here, but I have a background in business. And you said when you sit down with CEOs, you say you want to be on the leading edge and healthy food is the way to go. But it seems your own slide refuted that. What kind of evidence do you have that that's true?
I think, well, that's Okay. I didn't present you the growth in healthy foods, and the growth in healthy foods is also very strong. So I'm not sure what slide you're referring to.
The one where you talked about processed food in smaller countries.
Okay, processed food is not always bad food. Some of it is, some of it's not. The prices of healthy foods tend to be higher, so that's kind of bad for the consumer, but in some way it's kind of an opportunity for the business as well to get in and drive the price down. So I also think the a lot of countries, if you look at the high-income countries, the trajectory they took to get from where they were in the 50s and the diet in the 50s or 40s to where they are now, they're beginning to turn the corner. Some of the high-income countries, certainly some of the high-income groups, and some of the You've got that study in the GNR about obesity rates coming down in 35 states, is it, in the US? Is that piece of work? I saw the headline. I didn't see any of the details. Yes, I saw it at the stakeholder group. Yeah. So I think it's beginning to turn in some places, but the middle and low-income countries don't have to wait 30, 40 years. And in fact, one of the things I'm really interested in is the speed with which trends and crazes and memes get transferred across countries now is rapidly speeded up, I think because of social media. So I think the demand for healthy food is increasing quite rapidly, even in middle and low-income countries. When I talk to senior government officials in Ethiopia and Tanzania and Kenya, they don't want to talk to me about undernutrition anymore. They want to talk to me about diabetes and hypertension and heart attacks and then cancers, because their friends and themselves are getting this stuff. So this convergence of different forms of malnutrition is also a really powerful potential way of leveraging the whole issue of diets to make it higher on the agenda. So I do think I don't have a ton of evidence, but I do think the demand for healthy food is going to increase and is increasing very rapidly. And I think businesses it's increasing in the AB group, not yet in the CDE as the businesses would say, but I think it's going to cascade down. I think it's going to cascade down quickly because of social media and because of powerful policymakers, whether they're in business or in government. They're getting this stuff, and it's affecting them. It's expensive and it's devastating, and they'll want to know how to change it. So maybe I'm being idealistic, but I'm certainly optimistic that it will. And look at all the things that are popping up. The Eat Forum, the Fresh Initiative, lots of things that I don't know how serious some of them are, but they're signaling at least an awareness by companies that this stuff is growing in importance and it's not going away. Lots of celebrity chefs are quite powerful. Again, 5 years ago I was quite skeptical, but I've seen how important that stuff is. So, I don't have a convincing answer for you, but it's just my gut instinct. No pun intended.
Hi, I'm Katie. That was fascinating, thank you. I'm a consultant in NCD prevention, and I'm currently working with the World Obesity Federation. One quick comment first on your idea about first movers in reformulation. I was just thinking about Walkers here that did a lot of reformulation, I think, on salt reduction, but didn't shout about it. And they didn't shout about it partly because they knew that they then get at the CDEs. They wouldn't get, if you stick healthy on something, you actually put some people off. So you might find that complicates that kind of hit on profits, because they probably wouldn't have seen that because they weren't saying it was healthy. So that was just a sort of an initial comment. My question is about how can we as NGOs or researchers help kind of raise the importance of evaluation in this stuff. And I'm thinking here, I did some work on workplace health, so quite different, but still about the bottom line. and still about investing as a company. But it seems that a lot of places, particularly small organisations, would put workplace health in place, but not take any sort of baseline measurement, and then you can't evaluate. So it feels like if we're talking about these projects not being evaluated, is that part of the problem? Not understanding what evaluation can mean, and also not being willing, quite frankly, to put the money into evaluation. It's, 10% should be of a project should be on evaluation. That's quite a lot. And I'm just wondering how we can help raise awareness, particularly maybe among small and medium food companies, not the big ones. The case is probably made there, but is it through industrial groupings? How would we go about doing that?
Again, I think it's not just a problem of businesses. There are lots of NGOs that don't. In fact, the NGOs have come a long way in the last 10 years, I think. Big ones, anyway. But a lot of them didn't think it was important, didn't want to spend money on it, were terrified of the outcome, saw it as a punitive thing rather than a learning thing. So I think the job we did with NGOs, we just have to do with businesses. And if they do well, you have to celebrate it, and if they do badly, you have to show them how they can do better, and you have to talk to them about the merits of doing it and how it's not a terrifying thing to do. I don't really have a good answer for you. I'd like to see research funders generate more research calls around this issue. That's quite powerful. You could even have, heaven forbid, research funders in the public sector encouraging public-private consortia around these kinds of things. That could be quite interesting. But that doesn't really get at actually it could get at the small and medium businesses. It could do that. On your first point, I mean, I was at a really interesting meeting at one of the side events at the EAT Forum, and a couple of the companies said they put up graphs that said in the last 10 years our salt, sugar, and fat levels have come down. And I said, that's amazing. I didn't know about that. And they said, well, yeah, we'd keep it pretty quiet. I said, how can I do a retrospective piece of work that says these 20 companies have come from here to here? And they said, you can't, because we're not going to release that data. So is there a way you could go back in time and get those labels from 10 years ago? I don't know. Is there a repository of someone that keeps all the keeps all the labels? You would think there would be. There must be. But again, reformulation is tricky, very tricky, because of the things that you highlighted. But it's happened a lot, actually. Surprising. But not all companies and not all products and not all geographies. That's the trick.
Hi, Francesca Harris from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm in the nutrition group there. I wondered how much of your experience in your private or in the companies that you work with is in the sort of non-traditional food companies, so not just food manufacturers, for example, advertising or marketing, the softer sciences or any other type of things. Just what's your experience working with them? Is there interest there rather than just the food manufacturing side?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in fact, we have this work stream called How Do You Build the Demand for Healthy Food? And in that work, we don't work with food companies because there's an obvious conflict of interest there. We work with marketing agencies who they could be designing adverts for anything or sticky messages for anything. So we work with them. In Indonesia, we've been working with them around something called the Healthy Gossip campaign, trying to use emotion in its various forms to create messages that are really memorable and stick with people around healthy foods. Some of you have heard me say this, but most public sector messages around what food to eat are really scientifically accurate and worthy, but very dull. In fact, we were having this big discussion. We had a workshop last week on adolescent nutrition. GAIN and WHO co-convened it, and we invited 12 adolescents, so there was 60 participants, including the 12 adolescents from 4 different countries, and it was one of these never about us, without us. And the adolescents were giving us insights into how their buttons are pushed about what types of foods to eat. And everyone in the public sector, it was mostly public sector people, were just, jaws being dropped. And the more you can work with adolescents and people themselves, the more you can get a sense of what the triggers are, and the more you work with the companies themselves, who maybe have never worked in food before, you can get a sense. So we had this discussion about, the adolescents were saying, we would use Ronaldo and Messi to create messages around healthy eating and exercise, but we wouldn't mention the word health or nutrition, ever, because that would defeat the purpose of the project. So these kind of marketing agency, advertising agencies, they're brilliant at coming up with, they're brilliant at selling you stuff you don't need, but can we get them to help us sell stuff that we do need?
Hello, I'm Katie Thornborough, and I did a Master in Food Policy here a few years ago, and I was inspired by Tim, and I'm now a local politician in Cambridge. I was elected in May, and the council there have given me the title Lead Councillor for Sustainable Foods. So I'm also involved with Cambridge Sustainable Foods, which is part of the Sustainable Food Networks here in the UK. And we're trying to bring in a sustainable food policy in the council and coordinate the many, many good things which are happening around Cambridge and in the regions around Cambridge. But I've heard about all of these, and I suggested that we needed to find a baseline of where we are now, so that we could, as we try and improve things over the next few years, we can actually kind of pat ourselves on the back more, because we'll know where we've started from and where we're going to. But because of all the austerity that the councils are having to go through and all the cuts, it's really difficult for the officers in local government to put time into something like this. But I don't know if you've had other experiences about local governments taking really good initiatives and trying to carry out good evaluations.
Absolutely, not in the UK, but yeah, we have a work stream called Urban Governance, and it's about supporting city leaders to develop food systems that work for their cities and help them track them over time. We've only got it; it's only working in 2 cities: so Surabaya in Indonesia, and there's an Ethiopian secondary city, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. And like many people in this room, we see municipal leaders as big agents of change, because even though you have a smaller sphere of control, you have a greater degree of control over that sphere compared to a national leader, perhaps. So you're very important, and I mean, you should get some of the students in this room to help you set up a dashboard. But no, I completely agree with you. So municipal leaders want their populations to be healthy, and they want businesses to come to their municipality. So there's a potential synergy there.
Hi, my name is Ana Cueva, and I'm from Ecuador. I actually used to work in the industry as a nutrition assistant, and it's really interesting to see both worlds, because I also worked for a lot of research in my university when I was studying nutrition. And I was wondering if you see scholars or universities as an like a middle ground for negotiation, or for studies to be developed as well.
I don't know if, I mean, I think the key is to be a boundary crosser like yourself. I think that's the key, whether you're in an NGO or a researcher or a implementing organization. I don't, or government, I don't know, but somehow to get both, to be able to see both perspectives and see that there actually the potential for overlap is quite high. But I certainly think research can support trust. It can also undermine trust if it's kind of gotcha research. If the businesses do 49 great things and one bad thing, if you only focus on the one bad thing, don't not focus on the one bad thing, but try to be balanced, I think. To me, that's the essence of good research. the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's good research. And often we just focus on one of those three things, thinking that that's sufficient.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I've been just reflecting on something you said, Lawrence, about what this term engagement rather than partnership. And engagement, you implied in one of the things that you said that it can just be a conversation. And it's just making me think that when we're talking about evaluation, are we not talking just about, we're not only talking about what, as in, the marketplace for nutritious foods, but are we actually talking about the how, the process of how change happens, and how those conversations with industry and with the private sector take place? And is that a form of engagement which is actually really important and really meaningful, but perhaps it's a bit more in the shadows, and we need to be also looking at that in terms of looking at what the outcomes are on the things that we care about, such as nutrition. And it also made me think that we're actually about to start up developing a continuing professional development program of short courses on food systems and food policy. We're just going to start the development of that now. And we'll be targeting the food industry to teach them. And we welcome on our master's program, we welcome industry with open arms.
Good.
And I was thinking, is that then going to be a public-private engagement, or is it something different? But anyway, it's made me think, and I think it's made everyone in this room think hard about these issues. I hope it's helped your thought processes move forward as well. So thank you very much to Lawrence for that great presentation and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.